Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Robyn Smyers, the partner in charge of the Cleveland office of the law firm Thompson Hine and the secretary of the board of directors of the City Club. I'm honored and deeply humbled to introduce today's forum, a conversation between two people I've known and admired nearly all my life, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss, Jr. and the Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell. They'll be discussing the unfinished business of race. When we planned this event months ago with Reverend Moss, we had no idea how strong the desire of the community to hear from him today would be. Here we are, though, at a moment when issues relating to race have once again bubbled to the surface. The spark this time are high-profile killings by white police officers of unarmed African Americans in Cleveland, Ferguson, and New York, and a Justice Department report on the Cleveland police identifying patterns of unreasonable and unjustifiable use of force. Passions are running high, and even a cursory look at social media or the news will reveal just how truly conflicted we are when it comes to understanding causes and solutions. This is why we're so grateful that Reverend Moss is with us today for this last program in our 2004 Diversity Thought Leadership Series, which is presented by KeyBank. For many, Reverend Moss needs no introduction. He began his career as a Baptist minister more than 60 years ago in Georgia, where he served and led in the fight for civil rights alongside Dr. King. He came to Ohio in the early 60s, serving as pastor to Mount Zion Baptist Church in Lockland and as regional director for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1975, he came to Cleveland to Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, which he led for 33 years. Today, Reverend Moss will be in conversation with his longtime friend, the Reverend Dr. Joan Campbell. Her career has been long and storied. She is the former General Secretary of the National Council of the Churches of Christ in the USA and the former Director of Religion at the Chautauqua Institution, among many other important roles. When I was in middle school, I wrote a paper on her extraordinary accomplishments as an interfaith leader and renowned champion of social justice around the globe. Truly, both of them were my role models, and it's really a unique and special privilege to have them both here today at the City Club. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss, Jr. and the Reverend Dr. Joan Campbell.
Welcome, Otis.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here and a special honor to share these moments with my distinguished colleague and beloved friend of many years, Dr. Joan Brown Campbell. Our association, our friendship, our working together in many areas, and especially in the areas of religion and civil rights, really represent one of the remarkable chapters in my journey. Thanks to the City Club for what you have been doing for this community and nation for more than a century. And may the next century be as rich, if not richer, than the past 100 years and 102 years now. The topic we are dealing with today is not just local, it's not regional, it's not national, it's global. And it has been that for centuries. I would like to say just a few things before we go into our discussion. And by the way, since my remarks will be very brief, I decided not to bring a speech, but I just brought my notes on the speech. Speech is much longer than that.
Those are your historic notes.
There are a few things I would like to lift up Joan, and to the audience here, that we must grapple with some lessons that we must learn and teach from generation to generation. I take the first cue from something that James Russell Lowell said back in 1845 when he was writing against slavery. Many of us remember a portion of that writing in a hymn, "Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide in the strife of truth with falsehood for the good or evil side." Dr. King often recited that. But there's something in that writing, the present crisis, that we seldom visit. One line says, "It's prosperous to be just." And this is a part of the unfinished business of dealing with race in our community, in our nation, and in the world. We have to teach, we have to learn, we have to practice the profitability of justice. Now, we understand the profits that grow out of injustice. All you have to do is look around or just take a brief paragraph from history. We know that slavery was an economic enterprise protected by a political structure, covered by a religious phenomenon, a theology, and then taught by the systems of education. We have not yet gotten across the message that justice is profitable. It's not only morally right, it's not only right from a humanitarian perspective, but it's good economics. Atlanta today is a world-class city because Atlanta was willing to come to grips with race and race relations. It's incomplete, it's unfinished, but building on that principle has made Atlanta a world-class city, whereas other cities in the South and Southeast and in other parts are dying because they have not come to grips with this. There's another lesson we must learn, and W.B. Du Bois lifted this up in his autobiography or biography of John Brown. And he said, the cost of injustice is greater than the price of freedom. Injustice is expensive, humanly expensive. It kills individuals. It lynches individuals. It kills children. And we must teach that lesson, that justice is profitable. Oppression is expensive. Du Bois went on to say that injustice has an ascending cost. Justice has a descending cost. We can compare that with healthcare, with education. It's more expensive to have a community of uneducated, miseducated, half-educated individuals than it is to have a community of prepared, well-trained, equipped individuals. These are lessons that we must teach in this unfinished business. We have unfinished business in healthcare, in immigration. When I look at the Statue of Liberty, and everyone learned from early grade school those famous words of Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your hungry, your huddled masses yearning to be free." Now, what would happen if we set up that statue on the southern border near Mexico. What would happen if we set it up in Florida and pointed it toward Haiti? When Emma Lazarus made those statements and we built the Statue of Liberty and carried that poem of this young poet from the 19th century, did the statue mean Europeans only? Or did it mean all people? You're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses, you're hungry. Let them bring their lamp beside the golden door. That is unfinished in America. Not only that, but we have unfinished business, and I will stop here, with reference to the Constitution. When I hear people talk about original intent, I get nervous. Because every time I read the Constitution, and I carry my Bible and a copy of the Constitution in my briefcase all the time, but when I read the Constitution, I know that the first 12 amendments did not include me, and they didn't include Joan. For the folk who wrote the Constitution did not believe that their mothers, their sisters, their daughters, their wives had sense enough to cast a ballot. They were inferior according to the founding brothers. The Constitution is an unfinished document. So we had to add the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the latter half of the 19th century. And we had to add some more amendments to give women the right to vote and to give 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote. So we have added 27 amendments because the Constitution is great, but imperfect. Made by imperfect men and now imperfect women and men, and an imperfect nation. I said in a speech at my alma mater, Morehouse College, some years ago, that this school is an unfinished cathedral of excellence. America is an unfinished cathedral of democracy, and every generation must make its contribution. Every generation must see what Rabbi Heschel said regarding the presence of evil. Few are guilty, but all are responsible. Few are guilty for the death of Tamir Rice, but we are all responsible. We didn't kill Michael Brown, but we are all responsible for the consequences. We are responsible for the atmosphere, the policy, the training, and the activities and behaviors. I will stop there. My notes are still not exhausted.
If you're sitting there wondering what is she going to say after that, I know this man pretty well. And I'm not surprised, Otis, that you would give us the challenge that we need to hear. I want to take up just a couple comments on what our young woman from the YWCA had to say, in part because it was my initial lesson in race. My mother was the president of the YWCA in Youngstown, Ohio, many years ago. At that time, there was a white YWCA and a black YWCA. It was under her leadership that there became one YWCA. So So it started quite a long time ago. But what I want to really say is the phrase, "it's time to talk." I believe that that's correct. But I want to add to it, it is time to be honest. Yes. Because short of honesty, talking is not going to get us there. And I do think that in my own life experience, it's when the black community has been tough on me, not when they've been easy on me, not when we've had conversations that don't really say anything. We're very polite, but to move beyond politeness to honesty is what I know is going to change people's lives. And we have to not be afraid of it. And we have to not be so polite that you can't say to me, "Joan, why is it you cannot understand this?" What you know very well, the way I learned to be what I am was not for black people being nice to me. It was for them honoring me enough to challenge me and say, "Why don't you understand what we're trying to say to you?" I'm going to give a very short little story and then we'll have our talk. Many of talks we've had. And it's a story about when Bill Clinton was president, he decided it was important, again, to take up the issue of race. And I almost brought you a picture that I have hanging on my wall. And it was a picture in the White House of the people that were there to converse with President Clinton about how to go about this. And one of the key people was John Hope Franklin, famous professor at Howard and then finally at the University of Chicago. Died at the age of 90, gave us enormous wisdom in his time. Well, I'm not going to forget John Hope Franklin. I went to a dinner with him, and at that point, someone said to him, "Could you please tell me," at that point there was a lot of discussion about whether or not reparations for slavery was appropriate. And so someone said, "Dr. Franklin, how do you feel about reparations for slavery?" And he looked at the crowd, very distinguished professor. How many of you know him? Probably some of you do. He said, "How do I feel about it? I don't feel about it. This is not my issue." He said, "I think if we are to make a difference," and he said, "I speak to my white brothers and sisters." He said, "What I really want to say to you tonight is that what we need with one another is honesty. And we need for white people to understand the meaning of white privilege." And what he said was, he said in his own professorial way, he said, "Only when white people can look in the mirror in the morning and know that they can walk out of their house, most people in most places, and they are not going to be suspect by virtue of how they look. They may be by what they do, but not by how they look." And he said, "So I invite a conversation tonight with the white people who are here to talk about the meaning, what it would mean for people to really understand the privilege that comes to you simply by virtue of the color of your skin." I've never forgotten it. I thought it was a profound statement. It was a call to action for the white people, and it was a call to everybody, not simply to a few people. The word itself has become a little cliche and kind of not taken as seriously. But the way he looked at it was to say, and when we look at the police and we look at the black person on the street, I couldn't help but think of his words about the person who can walk out of their house and not feel suspect. And one of the surprises you gave me once in an honest conversation was to say, Otis Moss also walks out knowing that the color of your skin can make a difference in how your day will go, even though you're Otis Moss in a town that loves you.
Joan, these remarks bring me to something in your career, in your life. Tell us about your experience in your church and the disinvitation to Martin Luther King Jr. in Cleveland. And that, what happened? How did he get there? And what happened when he got there?
Well, some of you know the story, so for those who do, talk to your neighbor. But it was, for me, it was the life-changing experience in my life. And I was 32 years old. It was a couple years ago, actually. And Carl Stokes was running for mayor of Cleveland. And Martin Luther King was here to help with that election. He came every week. And he invited the churches to participate. I was the representative of my congregation in these meetings. Dr. King had a wonderful sense of humor, which most people, we take him very seriously. And once you're in history, that's what happens. You get taken very seriously and the real person gets lost. And one night he said, casually, he said, you know, I've been to all the black churches I want to go to for the rest of my life. I need to be invited to a white church here in Cleveland, and I've never been invited to a single one. Well, Miss Naive said, you know, God put you there because you're naive. And I said, well, you can come to our church. Our minister's been out in the street. He's been calling for racial justice. He preaches on it. He gives the communion in the name of this. Why don't you come to my church? This was Heights Christian Church in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Mr. Taft knows this story, I think. And so, long story short, needless to say, the congregation was not universally excited about his presence. And one of the most disappointing parts of it was that some of the major givers to the congregation decided that it would be too threatening to their particular profession at that time to have Dr. King publicly there, and so they rejected his presence. Fortunately, more people wanted him than were worried about it. And so that group of people got together, and it's like the movements are always. The movements are always made up of people who don't have the dollars and they don't have the stature, but they can risk. Mm-hmm. And so they said, no way. They said, we'll have him outside the church. And for reasons I've never understood, from that day to this, the powers that be that didn't want him agreed to that. Now, of course, the problem ended up that we had 2,000 people all across the tracks in Shaker Heights, and far more people heard Dr. King than could possibly have heard him inside the church. But the question you asked, it was a very, very painful victory. It was an ultimate victory. When the history of the congregation is written, it will be the noble history of that congregation. It will change the history of that congregation. But for me personally, which is the question you asked me, yes, it was life-changing. I had no idea how mean people could be. I really didn't. I just had no clue that there was that much hatred, that much worry, that much fear. Dr. King had already won the Nobel Peace Prize. And for those of us who stood with him, we became unwelcome people in certain parts of the life of people in the congregation. And it was, I guess if I want to say one thing to this crowd, if you decide to be deeply involved in the issue of racial justice, it will cost. And it will pay you back, Otis, with rewards beyond believing. I would have never been to South Africa. I would have never been General Secretary. I could have never served the World Council had I not have had that negative experience and realized the pain that exists in the whole area of racial justice for blacks and for whites. And so for me, as I look back on it historically, it was life-changing, and I'm enormously grateful. But I want to say for the days we're in, when you watch people out in the streets, it is not going to be easy. It is going to be difficult. And to be on the side of people that are trying to raise issues that need to be raised, for those who walk with them, it is going to cost something. And those of us who are in the ministry and people that we keep talking to, those who are benefit or don't from being a congregation, that is the constant message, I think, is that justice is costly. And it's also, as you said, richly rewarding and highly worth the cost.
You know, when you put this in when we put this in a historical context, it's not unrelated to the refusal of the Daughters of the American Revolution to allow Marian Anderson to give a concert in Constitution Hall in 1939. One of my college professors attended that concert. Mrs. Roosevelt intervened, and they secured a platform for her in front of the Lincoln Memorial. 75,000 people showed up for her concert on Easter Sunday morning. And the college professor said he could still hear her voice ringing in his soul at that concert, where Constitution Hall was too small, both in ideology and in architecture. But the open air, the wider space, welcomed her. And we don't know the names of those folk on the board at the Daughters of the American Revolution, but we still hear Marian Anderson singing, "Run along, children, to be baptized. Mighty pretty meeting by the waterside. Honor, honor to the rising sun." And often we demean young people when they introduce, sometimes not always well organized, always underfunded. We often demean them for going out without our approval. But not so long ago, we were doing the same thing.
Right.
The first time I spent a whole night in prayer was getting ready for my first sit-in experience at the state capitol, where the underground had sent us a note, "Don't go to the capitol. The Klan will meet you there." Well, they nominated me to lead the group to the capitol when I was not in the meeting. But they kept going around in the room saying, "Who will take the group to the state capitol?" And Dr. King's brother, the late A.D. Williams King, said, "I know exactly who will take us there. Otis Moss." And they were congratulating me the next day. I said, "Well, what is all of this?" They said, "Oh, you are leading the group to the capitol." I said, "I am."
And of course, you couldn't say no.
No. No way. And here was a part of a movement that laid the foundation for a new Atlanta. Dr. King eventually went to jail with us, and he wrote a letter to Mrs. King while he was in jail and said, "The suffering coming to our family now will, I believe, in some small way, make Atlanta a better city, Georgia a better state, and America a better nation." Just how, I do not yet know, but I have the faith to believe that it will.
You know, I have to tell you that you will love this story, Otis. I think you've heard it before, and I know we're going to run on our time, so I'll do it very quickly. When Carl Stokes was running for mayor, our whole family at that point was working for Carl Stokes. That was also not the most popular thing you could do in the neighborhood I lived in, but in fact, it was probably one of the most important experiences. And to make the story short, a 12-year-old daughter called Jane, of mine, was out there with us, and we were walking the streets, and we were not in a popular part of Cleveland for Carl Stokes, and people were throwing things at us and calling us names. And she looked at me and she said,
In Cleveland.
in Cleveland, yes, she said to me, "Why would anyone in their right mind want to be mayor of a city like this?"
That's great.
One wonders.
On that perfect note, today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a Friday forum with the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss in conversation with the Reverend Dr. Joan Campbell. We encourage you to formulate questions for our panelists now and remind you that your questions should be questions, brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Ideal Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Tuesday, December 16th, the City Club will host a panel discussion on looking back at the year of zero waste. On Friday, January 9th, the City Club will feature Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Tim McGinty. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at www.cityclub.org. Today's program is part of the KeyBank Diversity Thought Leadership Series. Thank you to KeyBank for your long-standing support of the City Club. We also want to recognize our community partners for today's program, Judson Smart Living, the NAACP, and the YWCA of Cleveland. Lastly, we welcome students to today's program from Cleveland Heights High School and Shaw High School. Student participation is made possible by a generous grant from the Laub Foundation. Now we return to our speakers for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today is Associate Director of Advancement, Mike Cromaldi, and Administrative Assistant, Jackie Powley. First question, please.
Good afternoon, Reverend Moss and Reverend Campbell. I want to thank you for your years of leadership. So often, I taught school for 40 years, and so I understand that a lot of young people don't know their history, and they end up getting criticized by adults because they don't know their history. Young people get angry with adults because we're not out there doing what we should do. So my question is, what do you say to adults who are critical of young people because they don't know their history and they're not passionate about the civil rights movement?
Well, first of all,
It's called preaching.
the adults don't know the history either. I think it was Wendell Phillips talking about Toussaint L'Ouverture said, people did not understand him because they read history with their prejudices and not with their minds. We have an eternal job of teaching. But first of all, we have to love our children. And we have to love them so deeply and so profoundly that we can be a healing presence with them. And when they make decisions that strike us the wrong way, we have to love them so deeply and remember our own imperfections and foolish moves and foolish ways when we were young, and some sense we haven't been so young, and provide for them all of the support and exposure and reason and guidance that we can provide, and believe that they can do a better job than we have done if they have the opportunity, the truth, the love, the faith, the understanding, and all of the knowledge that they can collect. It's a learning journey. We are all disciples. And in some sense, we are all children. These are our children. Tamir Rice was our child, God's child, everybody's child. Every parent in Cleveland and America ought to feel a kinship with him and with his family.
You know, sometimes it's been said that the bravest people are the young and the very old, for very different reasons. But I look back on my own life and think, I wonder would I have had the courage to do what I did. The more you know, the more courage comes with some difficulty. And so I think we look at young people and have to be grateful. They're willing to go take the risk.
Yes.
And to some degree, they're very inexperienced. And their energy that comes from that inexperience is a plus to society. Yes, it's got lots of knots and wrinkles in it, just like it is when other people do it as well. But I look to the people in the streets and I often think, I was there. What are we to learn from them? We have something to learn from. Why are they out there? What is it that they're trying to say to us that maybe in our older years and our wisdom, we are thinking they ought to be more careful. They do have some things to teach us, I think.
Hello. For those of us who do have a moral compass, empathy, and who are trying to alleviate racism as much as we can, what advice would you give us to deal with those, especially in government and in the justice system, who have no moral compass, who have no empathy, and who don't care about the disenfranchised? What can we do to change that?
You know, I have to say that that's a very, very good question. It bothers me questions that they don't stand up after they've asked the question because I could look at you better. I think that it's, I think Dr. King, the most amazing thing to me about Dr. King is not all the things, yes, of course, those things that people know about him and written about him, but to me it was his honest and deeply felt capacity when someone was completely on the other side from where he was, even filled with hatred. He could look with honesty and say to that person, can you think about this a different way? Can you look at what's at stake? And I remember I said to him one day, Dr. King, how can you do that? He said, child, we're going to keep loving these people until there's nothing they can do but love us back. It was a tough one.
Yes. When someone asked Dr. King following the March on Washington, what is the meaning of the march? Dr. King made a very brief statement. He said, we subpoenaed the conscience of the nation. And it seems to me that some people have to take on, Joan, that responsibility. Adam Clayton Powell said on one occasion that he was sent to Congress to be the conscience of Congress. At that time, we didn't have but 2 or 3 African Americans in the Congress. If there is no conscience in the community, we have to be that conscience. We have to create what Dr. King called a coalition of conscience. And someone else said, when a word must be spoken to further a good cause, and those whom it behooved to speak remain silent, anybody ought to speak and break the silence, which is often fraught with evil, because sometimes one word spoken at the right time can further the welfare of the nation. So as you stand and as others stand in your time and in your space, by God's grace, you can make a difference.
Dr. Campbell and Dr. Moss, it's a privilege to be here today. I was struck by the comment that you made, Dr. Campbell, from politeness to honesty. And it occurred to me, and then you told us that phenomenal story about your experience at Heights Christian Church and growing up in Shaker, both my wife and I growing up in Shaker and being a product of that environment. A few years later, we know that that didn't happen by accident. And thank you for being a part of that. as well as Dr. Moss, of course. Mustering the courage to be honest, right? And particularly, as Dr. Moss mentioned, Adam Clayton Powell as a member of Congress, we have more women and more minorities in Congress today than we obviously did when Clayton Powell was there. And yet I'm not convinced that the honesty is really coming forward in a way that we need to hear it in order to be able to muster that collective courage. It's kind of an extension of the last question. How do we encourage those who might need encouraging, even those who represent us? How can we encourage them to do the things that we are all perhaps struggling to do on our own?
You want to take it?
I'll take part of it. Thank you, Chris. You have one vote, and sometimes one vote can change a nation, either for good or for ill. I think Hitler won by one vote. On the other hand, the GI Bill that placed a foundation for the rise of a middle class in America following World War II, I understand, was voted out of committee by one vote. Some of the leading educators in the nation were opposed to the GI Bill, called the Veterans Readjustment Act. But later on, a senator said between 10 and 16 million people took advantage of that, and it created a new set of economic conditions in America. One vote, your vote, my vote, our children's votes, voter registration, voter education, and voter participation can change any community in a democracy.
True. Well, I just want to pick up on the other part of the question that you asked too, about honesty. And I think that we have to own the fact that honesty is not easy. And I think honesty between whites and blacks. Dr. Moss and I, if we had the rest of the day, which we don't, nor do you, the real question to ask the two of us would be, how did you come to the moment when you could look each other in the eye and say, no, Otis, I don't agree with you on that. And you could say to me, my dear, I think the fact of the matter is that you simply don't understand. And until you can say that, until you can be willing to, being honest is not really very popular. Your mother will always tell you it's the right thing to do, particularly if you're talking to your mother. But the fact of the matter is, to be honest has cost to it. And it doesn't mean to be blatant or mean-spirited or any of that. It's really to love somebody and to love what you're about enough to be willing to say, that's not, you know, it takes a lot more time if I say to Otis, Otis, that's not going to work. Because the next question is, well, then, what do we do? What will work? And so honesty has its own costs in it, but it pays off in the end. I'm sure it does.
I agree with you, Joan, very much. And I think in public life, whether you're the leader of an institution or a governmental body, we have to be able to take hits and criticism that may or may not be just. When Andrew Young was sworn in as the second African-American mayor of the city of Atlanta, he told me that black ministers and others had a picket line around City Hall the same day he was sworn in. Some of them were his good friends. However, his spirit was so inviting
Still is.
and so embracing that he never felt threatened by a single picket and never stopped being their friend.
That's right.
He has presided at the funeral of some of them and helped some of them get loans and jobs and build businesses because they did not allow this to break the humanity between them. And that calls for maturity, a special kind of moral courage.
Good afternoon. My name is Jerome Mills. I'm a senior at Shaw High School. My question for both of you all is, besides being an example to our peers, what can we do as young people to create change and to protect ourselves in today's world?
What do you say? Protect ourselves, huh?
What can they do as young people to affect change in the world? Thank you for the question. First of all, I would say, be the best that you can be. Our college president said to us, and you probably read this quote in some of Dr. King's speeches, whatever you do, do it so well that no one living, no one dead, or no one unborn could do it any better. When you become excellent, you become a leader. And in your leadership, you probably don't know how many people you are influencing right now. And that's at the peer level as well as at the adult level. You are a leader because you are somebody. You have a mission. And in your time and in your space, you can make a difference at Shaw High School, among your peers, in your community, and in your living room, and especially in the library.
Just one very quick word to say thank you in the first place for your presence here today.
Yes.
And for the question. I'm the grandmother of 9. Only one of them as young as you, the others a little older. But as I watch, there is some bond, I will tell you, between grandparents and grandchildren.
Yes.
That is a magical presence. And I think grandparents learn an enormous amount from grandchildren. Hopefully the reverse is somewhat true as well. But I think that it is your generation that has to take these steps. And this is important that you're willing to stand up in this group and say, what can we do? Because what we can do is exactly what you've just done here. Stand up, stand tall, and when you know something is on the right path, have the courage to follow that path. And you know what? Others will follow you. Mm-hmm. For sure, they will.
Hello. Knock, knock. So an observation of mine is that racism takes the scenic route, that it targets, marginalizes, ignores, and excludes. And as Cleveland is going through this renaissance, how can we ensure that the renaissance is one that includes those people who have always lived in this city, who in many ways have been unfairly and unjustly targeted by our criminal justice system? How can we make sure that the renaissance creates economic opportunities for Clevelanders? How can we make sure that the renaissance is also one that revitalizes our unfair criminal justice system? Thank you.
Joan, you want to speak?
You know, we're beginning to sound a little repetitive, I'm afraid, but how can it be assured? I want to tell you something. It cannot be assured. I mean, I can't stand here and say, I can make you a promise. I can be absolutely sure that that's what's going to happen. But I can tell you, if you and people who want it to happen, you and Otis and me and people in this room, if you got everybody in this room to say, are you all willing to be part of a team that can assure that the Renaissance of Cleveland becomes more than just the rebuilding of Playhouse Square, more than just the rebuilding of buildings, that it is part of rebuilding of the heart and soul of Cleveland? You might say, can we have some hands here? Because what we need are people who are committed to that. And then all we can do, people who are committed, is to work for it, to be willing to argue a little with people who push back and aren't for it. We can only guarantee it by our own actions. And you need to make an invitation to the people sitting here, how many of you want to be part of that program that comes forward. Benny?
Good afternoon. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. My question is centered around morality, race, and justice. During the civil rights movement, we were searching for the perfect victim. We know that Rosa Parks wasn't the first person that refused to give up her seat on the bus. And here we are today dealing with issues of police brutality, but we don't have the perfect victim. And so the media chooses to villainize true victims. When we look at the case with Tamir Rice and his mother and his father, the media chose to villainize them instead of looking at them as true victims. How do we as a society, as an imperfect society, as a man that is an imperfect man standing in a room full of imperfect people, begin to reconcile this issue of race and morality and address issues of injustice in a fair way?
One of the great unjust demands against an oppressed people is to pretend that you want them to be better than everybody else in order to get one half as much. All of your subjects and verbs must agree. Your ethical and moral record must be perfect. You must be a candidate for sainthood. That is not justice. And we cannot allow that to divert us from dealing with the question of justice and injustice. Saint Joan was burned at the stake before she became Saint Joan. And who was it? George Bernard Shaw, who wrote that famous play in later years and imagined Joan of Arc being called back to be congratulated on her sainthood. And she says to all of the priests and bishops and all of those who are members of the congratulatory team, "Can you unburn me?" 30 minutes to burn her, 400 years to declare her a saint. We have to be willing to meet those forces of injustice where imperfect people demand perfection of you. That cannot intimidate you. And we could just go all through history, name some perfect folk. I talked about the Constitution as being imperfect, and all of those who wrote it were imperfect. But is this a question of justice and injustice? We must never allow ourselves to get pulled into or diverted into a personality debate. And that's what happened in Ferguson. The dead person was put on trial and not the living police person. The dead person was defended, in my opinion, by the prosecutor. I mean, the living policeman was defended by the prosecutor, and the dead person was voiceless and defenseless in the grand jury. But we cannot allow that to stop us. We must not become so intimidated that we refuse to speak, or so filled with bitterness that our actions are so illogical that no one will take us seriously.
Hi, thank you so much for this provocative conversation. My name is Dr. Rhonda. I'm the founder and director of the Social Justice Institute at Case Western Reserve University. Anybody knows me knows I can get off task, so I wrote my question down. So how do you suggest that we begin to expose, dig underneath, converse about, and dismantle white privilege?
In our day, and Edwina, my wife of 48 years, can tell this story better than I can. We had a scientific process for preparing protests, movements, and initiatives. First, information and research. After information, education. Then mobilization. Then presentation of our findings, then negotiation, and if negotiations fail or are blocked, demonstration. The demonstration is not an end in itself, but a means toward something higher. The demonstration is designed to bring negotiation, and the negotiations are designed to bring resolution, and after that, reconciliation. Now, I can say that whenever we followed that formula, we won. When we did not follow it, we often lost. The formula, I think, still stands, but we have to teach the formula. We have to practice the formula and then experiment with it. And I think we will win every time.
Just one more minute. I want to say that I think what I talked about from John Hope Franklin is one of the keys to this. Because for black people to decide to get white people to know that they are privileged is not going to work. I mean, it might work, but it's not exactly the way I think the best way to go at it, even though it's true. But what John Hope Franklin, the reason I thought he had a lot of courage in what he said was, he was saying to white people, you have to own up to the fact that when you look in the mirror in the morning, you have a privilege. However limited it might be, it is still a privilege that does not belong to people in the black community. You can walk out of your door and you are not immediately a suspect human being. You're not immediately at risk. And I've never seen anybody wanting to particularly take up Dr. Franklin's charge, because I felt as a white person that what he had done had really said the right thing, which is, I think for many people, that they don't wake up thinking they're people of privilege, because the word privilege, if I could think of another one, it would be good. The word privilege, people will wake up and say, well, I don't have a lot of money, I don't have a lot of resources, I'm not privileged. But what privilege means and how we can get people to understand, it's the right to walk outside of your own place and not be immediately a suspect. That doesn't require being rich to have to know about it. Mm.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been enjoying an incredible, extraordinary Friday Forum, a conversation between the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr. and the Reverend Dr. Joan Campbell. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.